As Nigerians struggle to adjust to the new reality of the fuel subsidy withdrawal, attention is shifting to how the nation's government will also make adjustments to check wastages and unnecessary spending in government. In the first of Arise News special reports on reducing the cost of governance, Bengashi reports on the knotty issue of the structure of the executive branch of government.
With President Tinubu's decision to immediately withdraw fuel subsidy comes the painful reality of the sacrifice Nigerians have to make in order to move the nation forward. While the people are still grappling with the attendant huge rise in the cost of living, many are now asking the same from the government. The question is, will government and its officials do the same? This becomes more imperative with the stark reality of the nation's very poor finances. So in what areas can government complement the sacrifice being made by the people?
The first area is in the number of appointments, okay? He's going to make, whether as SAs or ministers. He should be a little bit circumspect and make it a very manageable number. He should also be interested in reducing the expenditure on medical tourism. All those specs of office like cars and all those allowances, he should keep it straight to the numbers that were recommended by Revenue Mobilization, Allocation and Fiscal Commission, and ensure that nobody takes beyond what is already made into law and in policy. You start by that and also advise governors or see how you can nudge them on to also cut down on the number they have at that level. And of course, by the time you begin to do it, then you begin to link into issues around corruption. Of course, in the last couple of days, we've been hearing what happened to the proverbial Air Nigeria. These are kinds of ways you are discussing 600, 700 billion in a cash-strapped economy.
The Oronsai report no doubt resurges as a reliable document that can help. Before the expiration of its tenure, the Buhari administration had set up another panel to review the report for a possible implementation. Let's take a look at the key elements of the Oronsai report. Reduction of membership of boards, councils, agencies and parastatals, merger of all research institutes under the funding of National Research Development Institutes, merger of regulatory bodies, merger of all duplicating government institutions, halt funding of religious pilgrimages, staff and management audit of tertiary institutions, reduction of statutory agencies from 263 to 161, and review of status of 541 statutory and non-statutory agencies. What should the Tinubu administration do with this report?
The leadership should lead by example, and part of it should be to cut down on the cost of governance, and which is also inextricably tied to corruption. And if we are looking at the Oronsai Committee report, it's been there for almost 10 years. And what is lacking is this implementation and the political will to drive through the reforms.
As the nation earnestly seek a way out from a painful subsidy regime, but would the Tinubu's administration heed the deafening alarm bells for the opt-in time for the Oronsai's report on cutting down the cost of governance? In the days to come, we would see what the Tinubunomics would be. From the head of service, Abuja, Benga Ashiru, Arise News.
Now joining us to take a look at the matter of high cost of governance in the country is Arise News analyst Dr. Sam Amadi, who is an associate professor. Dr. Sam, thank you for joining us again on Newsnight.
Thank you.
Now, 40%, at least 40% of Nigeria's budget goes into recurrent expenditure. A whopping 111% of our revenue will still have to go into funding consumption, or more than that. Paint to us, Dr. Sam, paint to us the reality, the current state of our national fiscal condition?
Okay, fine. I mean, it started with it. At the point we spent over 100% of revenue to pay debt, to service debt, not to pay debts. That was, I think, in 2021 or 2022. We had 100 and something percent, meaning everything. And it was first was 98%, which means if you had 100 naira, you spent two. You just have 2 naira for any project. You spent 98. You know, did it. At the point also, it was rumored that the government was borrowing to pay, salaries. Now, conceptually, the idea, I was a member, Jonathan appointed a committee, Presidential Committee on Reform of the Public Service, and I was a member. And myself and Professor Balogu, Emily Balogu, who was formerly the DG of the training center in Lagos, the federal government capacity building for parastatals, read a report, and we said 3 things. First is that original report is a good starting point. But again, original report is more reactive.
Right.
For example, you can't say, okay, merge regulators. You can't do that. You should look for, first define what is driving up this cost of governance. I'll give an example. Between 1964 to 1977, after independence, the current was about 168 million. Then by 1974, because of the creation of 12 states and all that, it went up, both state, regional and federal, to 1.something billion. So events drive up costs. The first is that we have failed to, we focus on what we call structure and money level. Structure is, okay, how many ministries do you have? How many departments? The money level is, okay, fine, who are members in the payroll? That's fine, but the key first thing is to ask yourself, one, do we have duplication of functions? This is very important. Do we have, wrong priority? Do we conceive ministries? So what we've seen, for example, in 2022, in 2011, the government set up a committee of old retired pumps, and they made findings. One of them was that every ministry replicated research planning department, even when they had no research to do. So that is, you see the same replication of the department. So for example, you have a ministry, let's say, that's doing basic transaction. It doesn't need a research. It could borrow research output.
Right.
When I was NEC chairman, when we do tariffs, we borrow from the central bank. They give us data on inflation, interest rate. We go to NMPC to give us data on oil production.
So that cuts the cost for you
exactly.
to go out there to gather.
Exactly. So what they're doing
data
is that they are replicating structures because of a misconception of why do you have this agency? That's number one. So you need to control that. Two is that what I call cost centers. If you go to Europe and elsewhere, there are ministries that are basically arise in this office, constitute a ministry. Let's say, for example, Ministry of Poverty Alleviation. It might be the minister with 5, 6 technical people whose job is basically to think through the policies of government, locate drivers of improvement in poverty reduction. You don't have to have personnel and management department, finance and supplies. Right. So that's also the driver. So what I would say first is the president should first take hold of Orasa report, submit it to analytical review. The first question is, are we designing the public service for production? And if we're doing so, what level of layering do we need? What are the functional work that needs to be done? And who can do it at what centers? There are many things that are that's correct. For example, look at some universities, okay? Even when we're in NEC, if you look at power sector, you have too many drivers, non-technical persons. So even though we lack data analysts, but we had maybe hundreds of drivers. So the question is not just cutting down cost. It's actually cost relative to outcome. Because if we grow this economy, by the way, the Nigerian public sector is not that big. If you look at data, we're actually a small public sector.
Yet.
But we are an unproductive public sector.
So that's where
the
it needs to start from.
What does the public sector do?
Excessive cost of governance. That,
exactly. So the first question is,
Nigeria has the highest. Let me just land on this because there are two issues now. There's on the one hand, there's the argument that, look, for a developing country like Nigeria that wants to build infrastructure and all of that, how do you, to what extent really can you realistically cut the cost of governance as a developing country?
Absolutely.
And on the other hand, what's really the best and most workable approach to cutting the cost of governance without, limiting
your chances of developing.
Absolutely. The reason why our bureaucracy grew in the 1960s, 70s was because of the imperative of development.
Right.
Industrialization. So we need to create departments of government, PWDs, multiply them so they can do the work. So I don't think we should shrink the public sector. We should right size it. That's not a different question. So the first thing you have to do is to say, there are many areas of employment people need to do. I'll give an example. We need job creation. Okay, so young people can go into, what you call public work, emergency public work, healthcare, rural development. So that's important. But first, you have to look at the difference between earnings. There's several, for example, National Assembly earns about 430-something million senator annual.
We're coming there.
So if you reduce those and improve general well-being across board, Nigeria has to be a more equal society, just like you have in Asia. The Asia economic growth was because Asia has very low inequality level and very high human capital. So my first take is, go back and say, are we just creating jobs for the boys? 2, it's not about retention people. It's about redefining the public sector and saying, do we need, for example, to have director with 4 cars? I mean, what should the director, what should the PAMSEC have 4 cars? What does it do with the car? If you have good transport system in the city, as we hope to have, so the concept is to reduce cost centers, drive down the cost of service. For example, the federal government under Obasanjo, under Kaite, said nobody should fly first class, including ministers. Now, if you look at, just do an audit, if you look at people who are flying out of the country, attending all kinds of unnecessary conferences, flying first class, the difference between the first class ticket and the business class is about 2 million some routes. So the question then is, how can you do this job at a more, affordable cost? Because the big cost does not guarantee big outcome.
Right.
Another example, why should ministries and departments hold conferences in Sheraton, in Transcorp, or in Fraser Suite? That's for private sector. If you're going to hold a meeting of 3-4 people, a meeting of 10 people, 100 people, why use those? When I was next chairman example again, we stopped using the hotels and started using our conference room. It didn't dilute the quality of
the deliberations.
But that also affects the profit for these hotels that you talk
so
about.
You have to ask whether the government should be the one spending, or whether exactly, because the role of government is to facilitate wealth creation, not to incur debt they can't handle. So the first question is that we are running the public service as if we are a royalty. It's like a privilege. And so the notion that government is to get there and get something, versus the notion that the ministries are actually factories to drive up private sector growth.
Let's put you on hold. We'll take a short break. When we return, we'll continue with this chat with Dr. Sam Amadi.
Welcome back to News Night, reaching you live from Nigeria's capital, Abuja. We're still with Dr. Amadi, and we're talking about reducing the cost of governance in Nigeria. I'm going to take you back to your last thought on wealth creation. Let's look at duplication of ministries and parastatals in Nigeria and how the money spent in funding that could be converted into widening the middle class that's dying for better wealth creation for the populace.
I think the first problem is this issue of duplication. And just with the example now, very clear. Okay, you have Bureau for Public Enterprises. You have the ICRC, for Infrastructure Concession and Regulatory Commission. Under various government, have had tough battle. Who is in charge of what? Now, what they do is under what we call privatization, whether it's concession or outright sale. Probably we didn't need to have that crisis. Okay. 2, all of them can work as units of the presidency. If you look at many countries in the world, the presidency can have a desk, a unit, say public enterprise unit, appoint a manager, a director, advisor, who works with a crop of few people. Their job is basically streamlining the policy and the framework for PPP, public traffic, or whether it's privatization or concession. Now, if you look at EFCC and the police, we might say, okay, fine, EFCC is doing a great job.
The ICPC as well.
ICPC and police and EFCC. When civil defense came up, I was one of the who opposed civil defense because I said, look, you can improve the police with different units. Right. Thankfully, they are doing well. Now think about Peace Corps. Some people had the idea to say, oh, we need to, somebody set up a private thing called Peace Corps. Before they rush a bill to say it should be made chartered as a state agency. We opposed. I spoke to a senator. He said, hey, but they're doing good work. I said, look, said they have observer status UN. I said, look, observer status UN does not mandate the state to create an agency. So what is driving it is actually the fact that the legislators themselves have opened the door too wide. Special interests. Anybody who conceives we need to get this done, and they have appointments to make. Right. And that's this incentive structure. Appointments to make. So we have multiplied that structure.
Very important is it to even address this particular issue now that our new president has a job on his hands to
I understand exactly.
Make appointments.
I think he's probably on this path. I heard that people were proposing some 60 SAs and go to 20. I mean, 20 is manageable. Right. It could go down more. Okay. 2, the president. We don't do what we call sunset laws, meaning in abroad, in the US, for example, they make laws that say, okay, 2-3 years. Right. If it's not to do authorized, that agency dies out because they work today. There are many agencies that are still doing what there's no market for in general term because they were created like 1960 and there's no sunsetting. Their work does not end because nobody put that device and nobody remembers to say we need to sunset this agency. So the new president now can look at this and say, look, let's do functionality test. What do these guys do? Can it be subsumed? I give another example. When we were in power, we have what we call LEMCO. LEMCO was set up just to manage the legacy debts. And many of us argued it could be a desk in DMO office. I mean, DMO is debt management office. Yes. So what's special about power sector debts that a DMO can have a DEX, not even a unit, a DEX officer, well-trained, competent fellow who will be there and manage that. So we created an agency. NEMSA, which they created, I fought it up to President Jonathan. Last day of his exit, they signed a bill to give an agency the right to go and certify meter. When NEC you created has a both technical, commercial, and social regulation. So the problem is the drivers of this crisis is first the lack of conceptual control of governance to say what is it that we want to achieve. If you define the functional work you want to get done, you discover that that's actually a department of government that you need to retrofit, improve to deliver. So this has now created a humongous, and based on our economy, our GDP, we have a very large public sector. Large in terms of layering, but not in depth, not deep in terms of skills and performance.
Well, the conversation definitely continues. We're going to be, staying on this for quite a while. Dr. Sam Amadi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always.